There is a tablet in the British Museum that almost hides in plain sight. It is not large. It does not rise up like a statue. It does not carry gold or lapis, and it does not glitter under the lights. It sits quietly behind glass, flat and brown, the size of a hand, the kind of object that can look like ordinary clay until you remember that this clay was once wet, once pressed by a human hand, once treated as an official surface where information could be fixed into permanence. The label beneath it is careful, as museum labels always are. A date range, a place name, a catalogue number printed in small, tidy text. Epic, fragment, mythological narrative, Akkadian cuneiform. A few sentences that keep the object inside a safe academic frame where it cannot disturb too much. And most visitors move on without realizing that the tablet is not simply old. It is operational. It still carries instructions. It still carries a sequence. If you lean closer, if you let your eyes follow the wedge-shaped impressions, the dense, disciplined lines pressed into clay, you begin to notice something that does not quite behave like a myth in the modern sense. The spacing is controlled. The rhythm is deliberate. Even in translation, the language feels restrained, almost bureaucratic. The text does not unfold like a folk tale told by a fire. It unfolds like a record being maintained, and that is the first reason this flood story refuses to stay comfortably inside the word myth. The modern story of this tablet begins in another kind of catastrophe, one that had nothing to do with water. It begins with fire. In 612 BCE, the city of Nineveh fell. The Assyrian capital, with its palaces and temples and thick walls, was taken and destroyed. Buildings collapsed. Archives were broken. The great royal library assembled by King Ashurbanipal, obsessive collector of texts, a ruler who understood that knowledge itself was power, was engulfed in flames. The invaders likely meant to erase the Assyrians, not only physically, but historically, to destroy their memory, to leave nothing behind that could speak. But clay behaves in a way that makes history difficult to silence. When clay tablets are exposed to intense heat, they do not melt. They harden. The fire that destroyed Nineveh did not erase the library. It accidentally preserved it. The tablets were baked, fired into ceramic durability. What was meant to vanish became something almost permanent, surviving buried under rubble for more than 2,000 years. Centuries later, excavators came to those ruins, mounds of earth in modern Iraq, and began to lift that archive back into daylight. Crates of tablets were shipped to London. They arrived broken, fragmented, covered in dust. Most were not immediately readable. They were catalogued, stored, and left in drawers and basement rooms where the clay could wait. And then, in 1872, a man named George Smith began to read them. Smith was not born into academia. He was trained as an engraver, a craftsman skilled in fine detail, someone who knew what it meant to copy lines accurately. He taught himself cuneiform by spending long hours at the British Museum, comparing fragments, memorizing signs, reconstructing broken passages the way one might reconstruct a shattered ledger. His work was slow, meticulous, and occasionally ecstatic. One day, while assembling fragments from Nineveh's library, Smith realized what he was reading. It was the story of a flood, not a vague mention of water, not a distant reference. A full narrative of destruction and survival, a warning from a god, instructions to build a vessel, the gathering of animals, the rising waters, the sending of birds, the landing on a mountain, the offering afterward. The outline was unmistakable to anyone raised in the shadow of Genesis, and this is why. Smith's discovery caused a shockwave in Victorian England. It was not simply that a flood story existed outside the Bible. It was that this story was older, much older. The British Museum was suddenly holding an echo of Genesis that predates Genesis by centuries. Smith presented his findings publicly. Newspapers reported it. Scholars debated it. The Prime Minister attended a lecture. The discovery did not destroy religious belief overnight, but it shifted something in the intellectual landscape. The flood was no longer only a biblical story. It was a Mesopotamian story, one preserved in clay long before the Hebrew Bible took its final form. But if we return to the tablet behind the glass, and if we return to the flood portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh tablet she, as it is often labeled in museum and academic contexts, we begin to see a second layer of strangeness. Because what survives in this story is not only the outline of catastrophe, it is the texture of procedure. The flood narrative does not read like a simple moral parable. It contains measurements. It contains materials. It contains a sequence of steps. There are instructions that feel almost technical. How to build, how to seal, what to bring, how long the storm lasts, when to release birds, what to do when land is found. The presence of these details does not automatically mean the story is literal history. But it does mean something important. The scribes who copied it were preserving more than a theme. They were preserving a method. Even the parts that sound poetic carry the weight of documentation. The vessel is not imagined vaguely. It is described. The storm is not a simple rain fell. It is structured in days. The release of birds is not a decorative flourish. It is a test procedure repeated in steps, as if the scribe is recording the process of verifying dry land. And when the flood recedes, the survivor does not simply rejoice. He performs a sacrifice. The gods respond not as distant symbols, but as beings with needs and protocols. They gather around the offering. They negotiate. They establish boundaries about what can happen next. Again, this does not prove anything about the event itself, but it reveals the mindset that shaped the telling. This story is about catastrophe, yes, but it is also about governance. The flood is not presented as random chaos. It is presented as a decision made by authority, a measure taken to restore order. The survival is not accidental. It is managed. The aftermath is not left open. It is regulated. The world begins again under new conditions, with new rules. That is why the tablet can feel unsettling when read slowly. Not because it screams truth in the modern scientific sense, but because it refuses to behave like a simple invention. It behaves like a preserved memory, copied and recopied, because it mattered to the institutions that maintained its palaces, scribal schools, and the British Museum tablet. Sitting behind glass is only one late copy in a longer chain, because the flood story did not begin with Gilgamesh. It appears earlier in other forms. It has older names: Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, different versions, different emphases, the same structural memory, warning, construction, catastrophe, survival, re-establishment of order. The story evolves across centuries, but the core remains recognizable, as if scribes were preserving an inherited template, adjusting details while keeping the shape intact. This is where our investigation truly begins, not with the question, did a global flood happen exactly as described? Because the tablets themselves do not ask that in modern terms, but with a quieter, more precise question. Why does this story carry the texture of procedure? Why does it read like something meant to be kept, not merely told? And if the flood story is older than Genesis, then the next step is to look at how the Mesopotamian version itself is constructed. What exactly do the tablets describe when they describe the boat? The materials, the measurements, the timing, the sequence. Because if this is a myth, it is a myth written like instructions, and that is a different kind of evidence. The tablet behind the glass leaves us with a particular kind of unease. Not because it demands belief, but because of how it is written. The flood narrative does not behave like a tale designed only to entertain or instruct morally. It behaves like something meant to be followed. And when we step closer into the text itself, into the boat building, section preserved in the Atrahasis tradition and later carried into Gilgamesh tablet 11, the tone becomes even more deliberate, more procedural, almost administrative. This is where the story begins to feel less like myth and more like a set of instructions. The text does not simply say, a boat was built. It specifies how, in the Gilgamesh version, the survivor is given clear directions. The god tells him to dismantle his house, abandon his property, and build a vessel. That first action is already significant. The instructions begin by clearing space, by removing ordinary attachments, as if the act requires a formal break from the world being left behind. Then the text moves into the details that would matter to a builder, not a poet. It names the vessel's form. It describes its measurements. It gives a kind of blueprint in words. The vessel is not a romantic ark drifting on divine waters. It is a constructed object with proportions, compartments, and ceiling. The lines are filled with technical verbs, verbs of making rather than imagining, build, set, load, seal, cork, divide, bring, gather, shut, wait, release, observe. These are not the verbs of mythic ornament. They are the verbs of procedure. They tell you what to do, in what order. They create a sequence that can be followed, and the more closely you read, the more this sequence begins to resemble something like a checklist. In Atrahasis, the instructions are especially striking because they are embedded in a context of decision and negotiation. The flood is not merely sent, it is planned. It is spoken of almost like a policy action. And in that environment, the boat becomes a practical response, not a symbolic gesture. The instructions are treated as operational knowledge, a set of steps that, if followed correctly, produce survival. Even the materials are named. Bitumen appears again and again. Black, waterproof, the natural sealing substance of Mesopotamia, pulled from the earth in places where it seeps up like a dark spring. The text doesn't merely mention it in passing. It treats it as essential. The vessel is sealed. It is corked. It is made resistant to water through layers of coating. In a world of mud brick and reed, water is always the enemy. Sealing is the difference between a house and a ruin. The scribes knew this. Anyone who lived near the rivers knew it. And the flood text preserves that knowledge with a kind of repetitive precision. Dimensions, bitumen, compartments. The repetition feels almost intentional, as if the scribe wanted the listener or the reader to hear these details and recognize that this is not a vague legend. This is a constructed response to an expected crisis. In some versions, the vessel has multiple decks. The space is divided. The survivor is told to bring in the seed of all living things, a phrase that sounds poetic but functions practically. It means representatives. It means categories. It means selection. Again, this is not the language of a dream. It is the language of preservation under constraint. You cannot bring everything. You must bring enough. The text even preserves the act of preparation as if it were a project schedule. The survivor gathers craftsmen. He brings materials. He organizes labor. He builds quickly. There are references to feeding the workers, to providing drink, to maintaining momentum. The flood is not something he waits for passively. He manages the work like a supervisor, facing a deadline, and then the text moves into another kind of precision. Time, not merely the storm came, but for days, a measurable period. The language marks phase arrival, peak, decline. This is how administrative records speak. Even disaster is counted. Even chaos is timed. The flood does not last forever. It has a duration, and duration can be recorded. Then comes the moment that many readers remember, the release of birds. But in the tablets, this sequence is not presented as lyrical symbolism. It is presented like testing. The survivor releases a bird. The bird returns. That is data. The earth is not yet visible. He releases another. It returns. More data. He releases a third. It does not return. That is confirmation. The procedure is repeated until the environment is verified. This is the language of verification. The birds are not only narrative decoration. They are instruments. They are living sensors used to measure the state of the world beyond the vessel. And again, the rhythm is almost bureaucratic. Action, result, action, result. A step sequence recorded in a way that could be repeated. When land is finally reached, the instructions do not end. The survivor does not simply step onto ground and begin again. He performs an offering. He sets up a sacrifice. The gods respond. The text describes them gathering, attracted to the smell, drawn to the smoke. This moment is often quoted for its vividness, but its function inside the narrative is almost administrative. It is a reopening of contact, a restoration of protocol. The survivor makes an offering because offering is the proper procedure for re-entering relationship with divine authority after survival. Even the aftermath is managed. The gods meet. They argue. They negotiate what happens next. In Atrahasis, the flood becomes not only destruction but a regulatory event. Humanity must be allowed to continue, but with controls. Measures are instituted. Conditions are set. Mortality becomes structured. Fertility becomes limited. The text reads like an institutional response to a crisis, an attempt to stabilize the system so that the catastrophe does not have to be repeated. This is why the flood story, when read slowly, becomes increasingly difficult to treat as merely myth in the casual sense. It is not only that it contains details. Many myths contain details. It is the type of details and their arrangement. The text emphasizes procedure. It emphasizes steps. It emphasizes materials and measurements. It repeats precision, dimensions, bitumen, compartments, days, and this repetition creates a strange effect. It feels like the tablets are preserving not merely a story about a flood, but a memory of how one survives a flood. Whether that memory reflects a single catastrophic event or a repeated reality along the rivers of Mesopotamia. The writing style suggests that the scribes treated these instructions as meaningful, worthy of copying. worthy of preservation, worthy of being passed down. Which brings us to the next question. If this narrative is written like a checklist, why was it preserved so carefully, and why does it keep appearing across different compositions and languages? Why does the same procedural flood template surface again and again, as if Mesopotamia was not inventing a story, but maintaining an inherited record of catastrophe and survival? The technical language of the boat instructions lingers in the mind because it implies something larger than survival. It implies planning. And if survival is planned, then catastrophe is not merely weather. It becomes something closer to a decision. This is where the flood narrative begins to shift again away from storm and timber, away from bitumen and compartment sand into a different kind of document altogether. Not a blueprint, but a courtroom record. In the Atrahasis tradition, the flood does not arrive like an accident. It is discussed. It is argued over. It is authorized. This is one of the most distinctive features of Mesopotamian flood literature. The disaster is treated as a matter of governance, not emotional wrath, not cosmic spontaneity, but administrative control. A problem arises in the world. Authorities convene. A solution is proposed. The solution is enforced in stages. When those stages fail, escalation follows. In other words, the flood is not simply an event. It is policy. The narrative begins with a complaint, and the complaint is almost bureaucratic in its tone. Humanity has multiplied. Cities have expanded. Sound carries across the plain. The texts describe the humans as noisy, and the complaint is not framed as moral corruption so much as disturbance, an interference in the ability of the divine authorities to rest. The details vary by version, and this variation is itself a scholarly problem. In some copies, the emphasis is on noise, in others on overpopulation, in others on disorder. But the consistent element is that humanity is framed not as sinful in the later sense, but as disruptive. The system is no longer stable. This is where the divine assembly appears. The gods gather. They speak. The language used to describe this gathering resembles the language of human councils. There is an assembly. There are great gods. There is a chief authority. There is debate. There is consensus, or at least a binding decision. And within this assembly, Enlil and Enki emerge as contrasting voices, not as simple opposites of good and evil, but as representatives of different administrative priorities. Enlil appears as an enforcer of order, the god associated with authority, hierarchy, and the maintenance of control. He is not portrayed as irrational. He is portrayed as firm. The humans are a problem. Therefore, a solution must be applied. Enki appears as a protector of continuity, a god of wisdom and craft, often aligned with the deeper mechanisms of life water, fertility, knowledge. His position is not always sentimental. It is strategic. If humanity is destroyed completely, the system collapses in another way. Offerings cease. Labor ceases. The infrastructure of divine human exchange disappears. Enki's interest is in management through adjustment rather than total erasure. Between these two perspectives, the flood becomes not a mythic outburst, but a governance debate, and the Atrahasis text makes this debate explicit by presenting the flood as the final stage in a sequence of escalating enforcement actions. The story does not begin with the flood. It builds toward it. First comes plague, then drought, then famine. Each action is a controlled reduction, a mechanism meant to thin the human population and restore quiet. Each action is like a measure taken by an authority attempting to correct an imbalance. And each time Enki intervenes, not always by opposing the decision openly, but by quietly helping humans survive through knowledge, instruction, and adaptation. The narrative presents these interventions almost like loopholes, as if Enki is respecting the formal decision while undermining its effectiveness through technical guidance. This structure is important because it shows how Mesopotamian writers imagined authority, not as a single will, but as competing jurisdictions. Decisions are made, but decisions can be negotiated. Enforcement exists, but enforcement can be resisted through cleverness. The divine world is not chaos. It is administration with conflict. Eventually, the earlier measures fail. Humanity persists. The complaint returns. Enlil proposes the final solution: flood. The flood is presented not as weather, but as total administrative reset, the wiping away of the record. Where plague and famine are partial controls, flood is erasure. At this point, the assembly's decision becomes more severe, and the text's tone becomes colder. The narrative does not indulge in spectacle. It treats the flood as the necessary final act to restore order. And yet, even here, the presence of Enki prevents the story from becoming absolute. The flood is decreed, but it is not uncontested. This is where the story takes on the shape of a court proceeding. The gods have made a ruling. The ruling is meant to be final, but a dissenting authority acts to preserve a remnant. Enki speaks to Atrahasis, not in open rebellion, but in coded instruction. He does not shout, "I reject the decision." He offers a word. He tells Atrahasis to build the boat, to preserve life discreetly, to carry forward what the flood is meant to erase. The careful nature of this intervention is crucial. It suggests that the flood is not only a disaster, but a legal act, something that must be obeyed publicly, even if circumvented privately. Enki's role becomes something like legal counsel, guiding the survivor through the technical requirements of survival without directly overturning the decree. And after the flood, the narrative reinforces this courtroom structure again. There is anger. There is accusation. Enlil is furious that anyone survived. His enforcement has been undermined. But again, the gods do not simply strike down the survivor. They negotiate. This is one of the most revealing parts of the Atrahasis tradition, the post-flood settlement. Instead of ending with survival, the story continues into policy revision. The divine authorities convene again and agree on new measures to prevent the crisis from repeating. This is governance in its pure form, not only punishment, but regulation. The solution is chilling, but it is described with procedural clarity. Humanity may continue, but its growth will be controlled. Certain women will not bear children. Certain births will fail. Certain priestesses will be dedicated to celibacy. Mortality will be structured into life. These measures are not described as random cruelty, but as safeguards controls built into the system. In the logic of the text, the flood is not the end. It is a reset followed by revised administration. This is why the flood story cannot be separated from Mesopotamian ideas about kingship, law, and institutional control. The gods govern the world through decisions, enforcement, and policy revision. They behave less like distant mythic figures and more like administrators responding to a problem that has grown beyond manageable limits. And yet, here we encounter one of the most important scholarly problems in the flood tradition. Motivations shift across versions. Some texts emphasize noise. Others emphasize disorder. Others emphasize the god's need for offerings and labor. Some later traditions introduce moral framing that does not appear as strongly in the earliest versions. The story evolves. It is copied and edited. The flood remains, but the reasons adjust as political and religious priorities change. This is not a weakness in the record, it is a clue. It suggests that the flood story was not preserved merely as entertainment. It was preserved because it could be used. It could justify authority. It could frame catastrophe as governance. It could explain why the world is structured as it is, and the fact that it can be reframed across centuries is exactly what makes it powerful. The flood, then, may not be simply a myth about water. It may be an inherited template for thinking about collapse. When a system becomes unmanageable, authority responds with reduction, then erasure, then regulation, which leads us to a question that sits at the edge of text and history. If the flood is presented as an administrative reset, and if it is followed by the reinstallation of order, where do we see that reinstallation most explicitly preserved as record rather than narrative? Because there is a document in the Mesopotamian archive that treats the flood not as a story, but as a boundary line in a register. It does not describe the boat. It does not describe the storm. It simply states, the flood swept over, and then it begins counting kings against. If history itself was restarted, the flood, in the Atrahasis tradition, ends with negotiation. It ends with new measures, new limits, and a world that is allowed to continue under revised conditions. But the more quietly unsettling part is what happens next in the archive. The way some texts treat the flood not as a dramatic climax, but as a dividing line in a ledger. Not as the end of a story, but as a break in record keeping, because there is a Mesopotamian document that speaks of the flood with almost no emotion at all. It is the Sumerian King List. The King List does not describe a storm. It does not describe a boat. It does not describe birds, mountains, or sacrifices. It does something different. It counts. It assigns. It registers. It makes kingship into a transferable institution that moves from city to city, as if it were a physical object, an administrative appointment, a file that can be removed from one office and installed in another. And it places the flood in the middle of that register like a cut-through. History, the opening of the King List, is a sentence that already sounds unlike most ancient origin stories. When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It is a strange beginning because it treats authority as an institution that arrives fully formed. Kingship is not invented by humans. It is given. It descends. It comes from above. The list then proceeds through a sequence of cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Shuruppak, receiving kingship and producing rulers. This is not written as legend. It is written as a formal register: city, king, reign length, and the reign lengths in this first section are immense. They stretch beyond anything that resembles human time. Tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, names attached to durations that belong to a different scale. Modern readers often assume these numbers are simply mythological exaggeration, and in many ways that is the most reasonable interpretation. They function as a signal. This is the pre-flood world. This is a time when kingship is closer to the divine, when the human scale has not yet fully arrived. But what is most revealing is not the size of the numbers. It is the format. Even in deep time, the list maintains the tone of administration. It totals reigns. It counts dynasties. It behaves as if the pre-flood world, however symbolic, was still part of the official record. The scribes do not say, "There were kings long ago." They name them. They place them in cities. They calculate the years. The list insists on structure, even where structure seems impossible. And then, almost abruptly, it cuts. Then the flood swept over. That is all it says. No description. No narrative. Just a line that functions like a stamp on a destroyed archive. Interruption. End of one era. Beginning of another. The flood becomes not merely a disaster, but an administrative boundary. And after that boundary, the King List does something almost mechanically consistent. After the flood swept over, and kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Kish. Again. Kingship descends. Again. It is installed in a city. The same formula repeats. Catastrophe, survival, a reset followed by restoration. The list does not treat this as an allegory. It treats it as the way history works. When the system collapses, the institution returns. It is restored. This repetition is one of the most important clues the archive gives us about how Mesopotamia understood civilization. The flood is not simply destruction. It is an interruption of the institution. The institution must be reintroduced, reauthorized, reinstalled. And then we see another shift. The reign lengths begin to shrink. At first, they are still enormous, but they move downward, from thousands to hundreds. Then, gradually, the numbers become closer to what a human life might contain. Eventually, the King List intersects with rulers known from other sources, inscriptions, year names, administrative tablets, archaeological contexts. At that point, the list is no longer operating purely in deep time memory. It is touching recognizable history. The effect is subtle but powerful. It creates a slope from divine scale time to human scale time, from a pre-flood world of vast reigns to a post-flood world, where kingship becomes progressively more human, and the list does not explain this shift. It simply preserves it. This is where the flood begins to feel less like a single story, and more like a structural mechanism in Mesopotamian memory. Whether or not there was a single catastrophic flood that erased everything, the King List uses the flood as a device to mark a transition from an older order to a newer order, from a world where authority is closer to the divine to a world where authority becomes fully terrestrial. But there is a scholarly problem here that cannot be ignored. The King List is not a neutral record. It is selective. It serves political purposes. It legitimizes certain dynasties by placing them into a continuous line. It rearranges sequences depending on which city's version is being copied. Different manuscripts show variations, different totals, different emphases. Some kings appear in one copy and not in another. Some reign lengths adjust. The list was not simply preserved. It was curated. This means we have to hold two possibilities at once. On one hand, the King List is memory, a cultural attempt to organize the deep past into a structured narrative of legitimacy, preserving the idea that kingship is an institution older than any king. On the other hand, it is politics, an instrument used by later states to claim continuity, to say we are part of the inherited order, and perhaps it is both. Because political documents often rely on true cultural memory, even when they shape it. The King List may not give us the flood as an eyewitness account, but it does give us the flood as a boundary that mattered enough to be institutionalized into history, a reset that must be acknowledged before authority can be reinstalled. This is why the flood story becomes increasingly difficult to treat as just myth, not because we can prove that event happened exactly as described, but because the flood is treated across multiple genres: epic narrative, divine policy debate, and administrative king register as a real structural break in the world's continuity. A story might be invented once, but a structural boundary repeated across. Archive suggests that something in the cultural experience demanded that boundary. Catastrophe, survival, reinstallation, the same sequence repeats, not as entertainment, but as governance memory, and that brings us to the ground itself. Because if the King List marks the flood as an archival reset, we are left with a careful question. Did the land of Mesopotamia experience interruptions severe enough to make such a reset feel plausible? Are there layers beneath cities, bands of silt and clay that echo the text's division between before and after? The King List treats the flood as a boundary line, one sentence that interrupts a register, one mark that divides deep time from a world that becomes increasingly human. It does not explain what the flood was. It simply assumes the listener will understand that something happened which broke continuity so completely that kingship had to descend again, as if reinstalled after a system failure. But the written archive is not the only archive. Mesopotamia left behind, beneath the city, mounds beneath the temples, rebuilt on top of temples. Beneath the streets layered over older streets there is another kind of record. It is not pressed by it is pressed by water. It is the archive of soil to encounter it. Archaeologists have to cut downward. A Mesopotamian city mound looks like a hill, but it is not a hill. It is a stack of habitation, built from mud brick reeds and refuse, raised higher with every rebuild. When an archaeologist opens a trench into such a mound, the cross-section reveals time like layers in a book, ash lenses from fires, dense occupation, debris full of broken pottery and bone, plaster floors, collapsed walls. Each layer is a phase of life. Each phase is separated by the next rebuilding. And then, sometimes, there is a layer that does not belong to ordinary life. A clean band of silt, pale, smooth, almost sterile. A deposit with few artifacts, few signs of human activity, as if the city was suddenly covered by waterborne sediment and left in silence for a time. These are the flood layers, thin in some sites, thick in others, physical interruptions that sit between occupation phases like a pause no one chose. One of the most famous reports of such a layer comes from excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s. Woolley's trenches reached down through the later city levels and uncovered a thick deposit of clean, water-laid silt beneath them. He described it as a flood deposit separating earlier and later habitation. The discovery was dramatic, and Woolley himself sometimes spoke as if this might be the fluid, identifiable signature of a single, catastrophic event. But archaeology has taught us caution. A flood deposit at one site does not automatically represent a universal event. Southern Mesopotamia is a floodplain. River dynamics shift. Floods recur. A thick silt layer may reflect one exceptional flood at while other cities experience different events at different times. Still, Woolley's discovery remains important, not as proof of one global catastrophe, but as evidence that floods capable of resetting a city were not theoretical. They happened in the very environment where flood texts were composed and preserved, and Ur is not alone. At Shuruppak, one of the cities named in the King List as the last pre-flood seat of kingship, archaeologists have also identified flood deposits. Shurupak's excavated layers show episodes of flooding that interrupt occupation. Here again, the deposit is not a mythic idea. It is physical sediment laid down by moving water. In some reports, the flood layer at Shuruppak appears in contexts where domestic structures and occupational debris are suddenly sealed beneath silt, implying rapid inundation followed by rebuilding. The effect is striking. The textual boundary in the King List appears to align, at least in cultural memory, with a city whose archaeological record contains literal flood interruptions. This does not mean Shuruppak was destroyed by a single flood that covered the world, but it does mean that Shuruppak was destroyed by flood events severe enough to enter collective memory. And when such memory is copied for centuries, it often compresses. It becomes one flood, one boundary, one reset. The soil, in this way, helps us understand how the narrative might have formed. Mesopotamia was built on rivers that were both benefactors and threats. The Tigris and Euphrates carried fertile silt, sustained irrigation, allowed cities to grow where rain alone would not permit agriculture. But the same rivers could rise suddenly, break levees, drown fields, collapse walls, and spread sediment across settlement surfaces. A city built of mud brick is especially vulnerable. Water does not need to be deep to be catastrophic. It only needs to soften foundations, and when foundations soften, entire neighborhoods collapse. This is why flood layers are not rare surprises in the archaeology of southern Mesopotamia. They appear at multiple sites, or Kish, Lagash, Shuruppak, though not always at the same depth or date. Archaeology suggests not one flood, but many. A repeated pattern of disaster and recovery. A rhythm in which cities live, collapse, rebuild. Over centuries, that rhythm itself becomes part of how Mesopotamians think about civilization, as something constantly restored. And this is where the multi-domain evidence begins to stack in an almost unnervingly consistent way in clay tablets. We have flood narratives written like procedures: boats, measurements, ceiling, days, birds. In epic and mythic compositions, we have divine assembly scenes that frame disaster as policy and administrative decision to restore order. In the King List, we have the flood reduced to a boundary line in a register, then the flood swept over, and now, in the soil, we have actual sedimentary interruptions, sterile silt layers separating human occupation phases, clay, text, soil, rebuild. The same sequence appears across different mediums: catastrophe, survival, reinstallation. Even the act of rebuilding is visible. Above flood deposits, city levels resume. New walls are laid, new floors plastered. Pottery styles sometimes shift. Administrative practices continue. Life returns. The flood does not end Mesopotamian civilization. It forces it to restart. And that restart becomes habitual, almost expected. This is why the King List can calmly say, "Kingship descended again." It reflects a landscape where continuity is fragile. So the flood story, when placed against the archaeology, begins to look less like a single global myth and more like a remembered composite. Repeated catastrophic floods along a floodplain, concentrated through scribal copying into one definitive narrative. Not one event necessarily, but one story that carries the logic of many events. A story that functions as a cultural container for what it feels like when water erases a city, and yet, even here, archaeology keeps us honest. Flood deposits are real, but they do not map neatly onto one date or one universal horizon. Mesopotamia's floods were regional, recurring, and variable. That variability is itself part of the evidence. It suggests that the flood narrative may not preserve a photograph of one moment, but a structured memory of a landscape that repeatedly interrupts itself. In this view, the Great Flood is not true or false in the way modern debates often demand. It is a record-shaped memory, a narrative built from repeated experience, curated by scribes, and preserved because it explains something essential about Mesopotamian life, that civilization exists on unstable ground, and that stability must be restored again and again, which leads naturally into a different question. If the flood story is rooted in a landscape of repeated inundation, why does it take on such a universal tone? Why does it feel like more than local disaster, more than a city's tragedy? What happened in the broader environment, climate, sea levels, river shifts that might have amplified flood experience into a foundational memory? The flood layers in the ground give us a material interruption, sterile silt between occupation phases, a quiet line of sediment that tells us water arrived with force and left with silence. But archaeology alone cannot explain why flood memory becomes so central in Mesopotamian literature, why it takes on such a universal tone, why it becomes the kind of story that cultures keep copying long after the original disaster has passed. To understand that, we have to step outward from the trench and consider the landscape itself as a system. Mesopotamia is shaped by rivers that are both predictable and unstable. The Tigris and Euphrates do not behave like gentle boundaries. They move, they shift. They carry enormous loads of sediment, and over centuries they redraw the land that people live on. A settlement built near a river is built near fertility, trade routes, and irrigation, but also near the constant risk that the channel will change its course, that levees will fail, that floodwater will cut through neighborhoods and deposit new layers of mud over old floors. The mechanics are simple, but their consequences are profound. When a river floods, it spreads sediment across the floodplain. When it floods repeatedly, it raises the surface of the land in some places and lowers it in others through erosion. Channels migrate. Deltas expand or collapse. A city that is safe in one generation may be vulnerable in the next, simply because the river system has shifted slightly. The land is never still. This is one reason Mesopotamian cities seem to reset so often. Not because they were poorly planned, but because the environment itself is dynamic. Mud brick architecture can endure in dry conditions, but it weakens rapidly when soaked. A single severe flood can soften walls, collapse foundations, and force entire sections of a city to be rebuilt. And rebuilding in Mesopotamia becomes routine. It is part of the civic cycle. But there is another layer of environmental context that may have shaped flood memory into something even larger. The early Holocene, after the last ice age, global sea levels rose as ice sheets melted. This rise was not gradual in the way a calendar measures time. Over thousands of years, coastlines shifted dramatically. Low-lying areas that were once habitable became marshland or open water. In the region of the Persian Gulf at the southern end of Mesopotamia, this meant that the interface between land and sea was changing. The Gulf pushed inland. Coastal zones transformed. River mouths shifted. What had once been dry land became wetlands and tidal flats. This does not require a single, catastrophic global flood to be meaningful to human experience. Even a steady sea level rise can create repeated moments of disaster. Storm surges reaching further inland, saltwater intrusion into fields, river flooding made worse by higher base sea levels. A floodplain, already unstable, becomes even more sensitive. In this setting, it becomes easier to imagine how flood memory becomes foundational. People living along the lower rivers could experience repeated, devastating inundations, sometimes from rain and upstream flow, sometimes from storm-driven tides, sometimes from the shifting boundaries of land itself. A single generation might witness a flood that seems to erase everything familiar. Over centuries, those experiences compress into narrative. The mind does not preserve every flood separately. It preserves the shape of catastrophe. Science, in this sense, does not eliminate the flood story. It explains why it could form. It suggests that Mesopotamian flood traditions may have grown from a landscape where water repeatedly resets civilization, and where environmental change over the early Holocene may have amplified that experience, making floods larger, more frequent, more difficult to predict. The texts then preserve those experiences not as a chronology of many disasters, but as one remembered boundary, the flood that divides the world into before and after. And that brings us back to the scribes. Because whatever the flood was one event, or many, what survives is what was copied. And the fact that Mesopotamia kept copying this story suggests it was not only about water. It was about continuity. It was about why civilization feels inherited and fragile, why order must be restored again and again. The flood story does not end where the water recedes. It continues in the way the story itself survives, copied, edited, renamed, and carried forward long after the original landscape has changed. This final movement is quieter than storms or excavation trenches, but it may be the most revealing of all, because what endures is not the event itself, but the act of remembering it. In the earliest layers of Mesopotamian tradition, the survivor has one name. In later copies, he has another. Ziusudra becomes Atrahasis. Atrahasis becomes Utna. The setting shifts slightly. The emphasis changes. The gods involved are rearranged, but the structure remains. Warning, construction, catastrophe, survival, restoration, the same shape, travels across languages and centuries, as if scribes were preserving a template rather than inventing a new story each time. This is how ancient texts live. Scribal culture does not transmit stories casually. A text survives because it is useful ritually, politically, educationally. In Mesopotamia, scribal schools trained students by copying authoritative compositions. What was copied became stable. What was not copied faded. The flood story was copied again and again, sometimes embedded in larger works like the Epic of Gilgamesh, sometimes preserved in independent traditions like Atrahasis. Each copy introduced small changes, adjustments in wording, emphasis, and theology, but the core remained recognizable. Colophons, those brief notes at the end of tablets, tell us something important about this process. They name scribes. They name cities. They sometimes mention that a tablet was copied from an older exemplar. This is not oral folklore drifting freely. This is controlled transmission. The flood story survived because institutions decided it mattered. The library at Nineveh makes this visible in material form. Thousands of tablets gathered, stored, catalogued. Texts from different cities and centuries preserved side by side. When the city burned, the fire that was meant to erase memory instead sealed it. The library's survival is not accidental. It is a reminder that what we call myth often persists because it was treated as record. And from Mesopotamia, the flood story moves outward. Later, Babylonian traditions preserve it. Still later, versions appear in the Hebrew Bible, reshaped to fit a different theological framework. The names change, the moral emphasis shifts, but the procedural boat, the animals, the testing of land, the sacrifice remains strangely familiar. This is not because one culture copied blindly from another, but because scribes worked with inherited material, adapting it to new contexts while preserving its structure. The question, then, is not which version is true in an absolute sense. The more careful question is how one catastrophe memory became so durable that it could be retold across civilizations, each time reshaped but never erased. Why this story, and not countless others, became foundational. One possibility is simple. The flood story condensed many experiences into one. Many floods remembered as a single flood. Many city resets remembered as one world reset. The myth preserved the shape of a real disaster, a photograph, but a pattern. A way of understanding collapse and recovery in a land where water repeatedly erased what humans built. And perhaps the truth lies not in proving or disproving the flood, but in noticing what the tablets keep repeating, the emphasis on procedure, on survival through preparation, on order returning after catastrophe, on authority being reinstalled rather than invented. Silence in this archive is not absence. The gaps between versions, the edits, the omissions, these are part of how memory works. What is repeated is what mattered. What fades is what institutions no longer needed. So the flood story rests now behind glass, catalogued and labeled, often reduced to a footnote in religious history or a curiosity in museum halls. But the tablets themselves suggest something quieter and more persistent. They suggest that the flood was never only about water. It was about how civilizations remember collapse, and how they explain why order returns at all. Maybe it was many floods remembered as one. Maybe the myth preserved the shape of a real disaster. And maybe the truth is not hidden in one tablet or one trench, but in the fact that the story was copied at all. For now, we can let the tablets rest. Let the clay keep its impressions. Let the silence between versions remain part of the evidence. The flood does not need to be proven to be meaningful. It only needs to be remembered, and in Mesopotamia it was.